Rebecca Downey reached for the alarm clock, which tore through the morning silence with a shrill ringing. 5:30 in the morning. Her hand rested on her still flat stomach in an instinctive, protective gesture. 10 weeks. 10 weeks to their little secret. She smiled, looking up at the ceiling of her small apartment in suburban Portland. Nausea came suddenly. Rebecca scrambled out of bed and rushed to the bathroom. A few minutes later, she sank to the floor, leaning against the cold wall. A morning ritual for the past 2 weeks. "Get used to it," she whispered to herself, picking herself up off the floor. It would be like this every morning from now on. The mirror reflected a young woman with brown hair pulled back into a casual bun and bright green eyes that betrayed fatigue despite her 28 years. 8 years on the force, the last 3 in the narcotics division. Today was going to be a big day. Rebecca opened the cabinet above the sink and pulled out the nausea pills her doctor had prescribed. Next to it lay the ultrasound image she'd gotten last week, a small, blurry spot, her and Michael's baby. She buttoned her uniform shirt carefully, trying to ignore the fact that it had gotten a little tighter in her chest. It was good that the loose fit of the police uniform hid the first signs of pregnancy. No one at work knew yet, and she planned to keep it a secret for as long as possible, especially because of Michael. Their relationship was complicated. They'd met on a bust 2 years ago. She was a young officer who had just transferred to the narcotics division. He was an informant helping the police reach a major dealer. Their attraction to each other was instant and inexplicable. Then Michael did something stupid. Armed robbery during a breakdown. 4 years in prison. They'd been together for a year when he went to jail. Now he'd served 18 months. Today she was going to have to tell him about the baby. Visiting day at Eastern State Correctional Facility. The drive to the station took 20 minutes. Rebecca parked her tattered Ford in the employee parking lot and took a deep breath, preparing for the day's work. "Hey, Downey," Sarah Mitchell called out to her as she headed toward the main entrance. "You're just in time. Today's the big day." Sarah was her best friend at the station. They'd been through the police academy together and had supported each other over the years. Sarah was one of the few people who knew about her relationship with Michael, even though she strongly disapproved of it. "What's going on?" Rebecca asked, picking up her bag. "Operation Labyrinth is in action today. Harris is rounding everyone up in 15 minutes. Rebecca nodded, feeling a rush of adrenaline. Operation Maze was a major raid on the methamphetamine distribution network they'd been planning for months. Several police departments and even DEA agents were involved. They walked into the briefing room where about 20 officers were already gathered. Detective James Harris stood at the whiteboard, intently studying the pictures and diagrams pinned to it. When Rebecca walked in, he looked up and nodded briefly. Harris had been her mentor since her first days in the narcotics department. Harsh, demanding, but fair. A 50-year veteran of the force with graying temples and deep wrinkles on his face that seemed to tell stories about every tough case in his career. "So," Harris began when everyone was seated, "today we conclude a 6-month investigation. The target is Richard Chemist Dawson and his distribution network." He pointed to a photograph of a lean, middle-aged man with cold eyes. "We have 3 locations that we will storm simultaneously: the main lab, the warehouse, and the distribution point. Downey, you're with me in the Alpha team. We're taking the lab." Rebecca felt her stomach clench. The lab was the most dangerous point. Toxic chemicals, armed guards. For a moment, her hand instinctively jerked toward her stomach. Harris noticed the movement and frowned. "Trouble, Downey?" "No trouble at all, sir," she replied quickly. "Just a little indigestion from this morning's coffee." He stared at her for a few more seconds before continuing his instructions. Rebecca avoided the gaze of Sarah, who she knew was looking at her with suspicion. After the briefing, when everyone had gone to get ready, Sarah caught her in the hallway. "Are you okay? You look pale." "I just didn't get much sleep," Rebecca lied. "Are you sure you want to be part of the operation today? I can talk to Harris." "Sarah, stop it," Rebecca cut her off. "I'm perfectly fine. It's my job." Sarah didn't look convinced, but nodded. "And you're going to see him tonight?" There was no need to specify who she meant. "Yes." Rebecca lowered her voice. "I have to tell him." "Oh." Sarah stopped talking, her eyes widening. Are you sure that's a good idea? It's his baby, Sarah. He has a right to know. You know, you could... No, Rebecca replied sharply. I'm keeping this baby, and Michael will be a part of its life when he gets out. There are only 2.5 years left. Sarah sighed. You've always been stubborn, Becky. Just, be careful, okay? Today in surgery and, with him. Rebecca nodded, squeezing her friend's hand. Always. Operation Labyrinth was a success, though not without complications. They were met with an armed response at the lab. 2 officers suffered minor injuries, but all suspects were apprehended, including the chemist himself. Rebecca was in the thick of it when one of the suspects tried to start the process of destroying evidence through a chemical reaction. She managed to prevent a potential explosion, for which she received a nod of approval from Harris. They returned to the station in the afternoon, tired but pleased with the result. Rebecca quickly filed the necessary reports and glanced at her watch. Visiting hours at the colony started in an hour, and she needed 30 minutes to get there. Harris, she approached the detective. Can I leave early? I've filled out all the reports. The detective looked at her with his probing gaze. Is today visiting day? Yes, sir. Harris knew about her relationship with Michael. Unlike most in the precinct, he didn't openly judge her, but his silent disapproval was felt every time the subject came up. You did a good job today, Downey. Go, but stay in touch if you need me. Thank you, sir. Rebecca quickly changed into civilian clothes, simple jeans and a loose shirt, and headed for her car. The drive to the Eastern State Correctional Facility was scenic, but Rebecca barely noticed the scenery outside the window. Her thoughts were preoccupied with the upcoming conversation. How would Michael react? Would he be pleased, or would it make his incarceration more difficult, knowing that his child was growing up without him? The procedure for entering the prison was familiar and routine. ID check, security screening, metal detector. Rebecca went through them automatically, nodding to the familiar guards. Thomas Barnes, the warden, spotted her in the hallway and approached, extending his hand. Officer Downey, nice to see you again. Hello, Mr. Barnes, she replied politely, shaking his hand. Reiner is waiting in the visiting room. He looks tense today. Rebecca felt a prick of worry. Something wrong? A little altercation with another inmate yesterday. Nothing serious, but keep it in mind. She nodded and continued towards the visiting room. A large space with several tables where inmates talked to family and friends under the watchful eye of the guards. Michael was already seated at the far table. Tall, with an athletic build and short dark hair, he looked out of place in his orange prison uniform. His face, usually animated at the sight of Rebecca, was grim today. A fresh bruise was visible under his eye. Hi, she said, sitting down across from him. Hi. His voice sounded distant. How was the raid? Rebecca froze. She hadn't told him about Operation Labyrinth. How do you know? I have my sources. He smiled weakly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Are you okay? You're not hurt? I'm perfectly fine, she assured him. But what happened to you? Barnes said about some kind of altercation. Michael shrugged. The usual prison stuff, nothing serious. They were silent for a while. Usually their conversations flowed easily, but today it was as if a wall had grown between them. Michael, I have some news, Rebecca finally said. Important news. He looked up, and something like fear flashed in his eyes. I'm pregnant, she said quietly. 10 weeks. It happened on your last home vacation. Michael froze, his face impenetrable. Are you sure? Yeah. I went to the doctor. I had an ultrasound. So what are you planning to do? I'm keeping the baby, she said firmly. I want this baby, Michael. Our baby. He stared at her for a long moment, then reached across the table. Rebecca took his palm in hers. I'll be out in 2.5 years, he said. The baby will be 2. We'll manage, she assured him. I'll be fine until you get out. What about the job? It's dangerous, Becky, especially in your department. I'll move into administrative work when the time comes, she said. It's gonna be okay, Michael. We'll be a family. He squeezed her hand, but something in his gaze bothered Rebecca. A kind of detachment that hadn't been there before. Aren't you excited? She asked, feeling her heart clench. Of course I'm glad, he answered quickly. It's unexpected, and it's not the best situation. I'm here and you're out there alone. I'm not alone. I have friends, co-workers. Do your co-workers know about me? Rebecca looked away. Some. Sarah does. And Harris. And what do they think? It doesn't matter, she replied. All that matters is what you and I think. Michael nodded, but it seemed that his thoughts were far away. You should go, he said suddenly, releasing her hand. You've had a hard day. Michael, we still have time. I need to think about this, Becky. Please. She stared at him, trying to figure out what was going on, but his face remained impenetrable. Okay, she finally said, standing up. I'll come back on the next visitation day. I'll be waiting, he replied without looking at her. All the way home, Rebecca tried to figure out what had gone wrong. Michael's reaction was not what she expected. Not joy, not shock even, but some kind of detachment, like he wasn't with her anymore. She returned to the apartment late at night, emotionally drained. Dropping her shoes in the hallway, she walked into the living room and froze. Something was wrong. She couldn't say exactly what, but years of police work had sharpened her senses. Her hand reached for the gun she always carried with her, even off-duty. Is anyone there? She called out, moving slowly into the interior of the apartment. Silence. But the feeling of an intruder's presence didn't go away. Rebecca checked the living room, the kitchen, then headed for the bedroom. The door was ajar, though she remembered closing it in the morning. Her heart pounded frantically as she pushed the door open and stepped into the room, holding her gun at the ready. The bedroom was empty, but there was something lying on the bed that hadn't been there in the morning. A small children's toy teddy bear. Rebecca lowered the gun, looking at the toy in confusion. As she got closer, she noticed a note under the bear. Congratulations on the baby. See you soon, Em. But it couldn't be Michael. He was in prison, hundreds of miles away. Someone had been in her apartment. Someone who knew she was pregnant. A sudden noise behind her made her turn around sharply, but it was too late. A heavy blow fell on her head, and the world was plunged into darkness. Asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk. Detective James Harris drummed his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel, parked in front of Rebecca's house. She hadn't shown up for the morning briefing, hadn't answered her cell phone. That was completely unlike her. Even on visiting days, she was always punctual. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut, the same gut feeling he'd developed during his 25 years on the force. He got out of the car and headed for the driveway. Once he reached the third floor, he knocked on her apartment door. Downey? It's Harris. Open up, please. No answer. He knocked harder. Rebecca? Are you there? No answer again. Harris checked the doorknob. It was locked. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed Sarah Mitchell. Mitchell? Downey didn't show up for service and she's not answering the door. Do you have a spare key to her apartment? I do. Sarah's voice sounded concerned. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Hurry up. The wait seemed like an eternity. Something was definitely wrong. Rebecca was too responsible to just not show up for work unannounced. Sarah arrived 17 minutes later, out of breath and with worry in her eyes. What's wrong? Is she okay? I don't know, Harris replied. Give me the key. Sarah handed him a bunch of keys, the second one on the left. Harris opened the door and cautiously entered the apartment. Downey, it's Harris and Mitchell. You home? The silence in response was oppressive. They moved slowly through the hallway into the living room. Everything looked normal, no signs of struggle or forced entry. Check the kitchen, Harris said to Sarah. I'll look in the bedroom. He walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, feeling the anxiety rising with each step. The bedroom door was ajar. He pushed it open. Oh my God, Sarah, call for backup and forensics, now. Rebecca Downey was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling with lifeless eyes. Her pale skin contrasted with the dark bloodstains that soaked the bed. A teddy bear lay next to her, also stained with blood. Harris checked for a pulse, even though he already knew he wouldn't find one. Her body was cold. Death had occurred hours ago. Sarah ran into the room and froze when she saw her friend's body. No. Call everyone, Harris repeated, not taking his eyes off Rebecca. And don't tell anyone about her condition. It's for our information only for now. Her condition? Sarah questioned incomprehensibly. She was pregnant, Harris said quietly. Did she tell you? Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. 10 weeks, with Michael Rayner. Harris clenched his jaws. Rayner? He shook his head. Call everyone in, Mitchell. We'll find whoever did this. I swear. An hour later, Rebecca's apartment was a crime scene. Forensics were working, taking pictures and collecting evidence. Cops were canvassing the neighborhood. Harris stood off to the side, stone-faced, watching the process. Detective, one of the CSIs approached him. We found a note. He held out a plastic bag with a piece of paper. It said in scrawled handwriting, "Congratulations on the baby. See you soon. M." Harris mumbled. Michael Rayner. But how could he have done it? Sarah asked, standing next to him. He's in prison. Men like him always have ways, Harris replied grimly. People on the outside who will do his errands, but we're gonna find out, and he'll answer for it. I swear on Rebecca's memory. Detective James Harris sat in his office, staring at a board of photographs. In the center was a smiling Rebecca Downey in her police uniform, flanked by crime scene photos. It had been 2 days since the body had been found, but he'd hardly left the station, sleeping on the couch in the break room for only a few hours at a time. There was a cooled cup of coffee in the corner, his fifth one of the morning. He rubbed his red eyes and went back to the coroner's report. Death had occurred between 21 and 23 hours, caused by multiple stab wounds to the chest area. Pregnancy was confirmed at 10 weeks. No signs of sexual assault. Killer was cold-blooded and methodical. Detective, Sarah Mitchell came through the door. Her eyes were swollen with tears, but her voice was firm. You asked me to let you know when the security footage arrived. Come in, Harris gestured for her to come in, and close the door. Sarah sat down across from him, placing the folder on the desk. We've collected all the available footage from the cameras in the area around her apartment 12 hours before the estimated time of the murder. The techs are reviewing them now. Good, Harris nodded. How are you holding up? Sarah smiled weakly. Trying not to think about Becky being in those pictures, focusing on work. That's right. Harris was quiet for a moment, then asked, What can you tell me about her relationship with Rayner? Everything you know. Sarah took a deep breath. They met 2 years ago during Operation Crossroads. Michael was an informant, helped us get to Lorenzo's group. Becky was a liaison officer. Met with him, got information from the very beginning between them. There was chemistry, I'd say. I warned her it was unprofessional, that he was a criminal element, but she wouldn't listen, Harris finished. She said there was something special about him, that he wasn't like the other criminals she'd dealt with, that he had a good heart, that life just hadn't turned out right. Harris snorted. Classic story. After the operation was over, they'd started dating, officially. Michael tried to quit, got a job as an auto mechanic. They seemed to be doing well, but after about a year, he snapped. He went back to drugs, and then that robbery. Sarah shook her head. Becky was devastated, but she didn't leave him. Visited him every week in prison. Believed he'd change. And Rayner himself? Did he love her? Sarah thought about it. It's hard to say. Sometimes I thought he did. He gave her gifts, wrote her letters from prison. But there were times... She stopped talking. What kind of moments? Harris persisted. Moments when I saw something cold in him, calculating, as if his feelings for her were a tool. Becky told me that sometimes he became very controlling, wanted to know where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. After he was arrested, it escalated. You think he might have been jealous? Definitely, especially in the last few months. Becky mentioned that he often asked about her male co-workers. Harris wrote something down in his notebook. Did she tell you about her plans to tell him about the pregnancy? Yes, she planned to tell him on the day that... Sarah swallowed. The day she was killed. She was at his prison the day before she died. We checked it out. She did visit him from 14:30 to 15:15. Harris tapped his pencil on the desk. What else do we know about Rayner? Before he met Becky, he had a few priors for drug possession, petty theft, no serious violent history. But he had connections in the underworld. Sarah was silent. You think he could have arranged her murder from prison? It's a working theory. The note found at the crime scene is signed M. Michael and a teddy bear toy, as a sign that he knew about the baby. But why would he kill her? Especially if he got her pregnant? Maybe that's why, Harris said grimly. Jealousy, control. She had another 2.5 years to raise the child alone while he was incarcerated. A lot could happen in that time. She could meet someone else, forget about him. Becky's not like that. Sarah shook her head. She was devoted to him. He might have thought otherwise. Harris sighed and stood up. Let's go. We need to question the other employees. Maybe someone else knows something about their relationship. They spent the entire day interviewing Rebecca's co-workers. Most knew about her relationship with the prisoner, though they didn't approve of it. None had anything new to report that could help the investigation. Some mentioned that in recent weeks Rebecca had seemed distracted, sometimes nervous, but wrote it off to the stress of the job. By evening, back in his office, Harris felt exhausted both physically and emotionally. He was about to go home to get some sleep when there was a knock on the door. Detective, it was the young officer, Greg Parker. May I? Come in, Parker. What do you got? Parker shifted nervously from foot to foot. I hear you're interviewing everyone about Downey and Rayner. Yeah, and? I didn't know if I should say anything, but he hesitated. About a month ago, I saw Downey talking to a man. They were sitting in a coffee shop across the street from the precinct. The conversation seemed, tense. Harris straightened up. Do you know who it was? No, sir. Never seen him before. Tall, dark hair, well-dressed. Looked, like a businessman, maybe. But the strange thing is, when he saw me through the window, he left quickly, and Downey seemed pretty upset. Did you talk to her about it? I tried the next day, but she dismissed it. Said it was just an old acquaintance. Harris made a note in his notebook. Thanks, Parker. This could be important. After the officer left, Harris sat in silence for a while, pondering the information he had received. Who was this man? And why was Rebecca upset after meeting him? He decided it was time to talk to Michael Rayner himself. The next morning, Harris drove his old Ford down the road to the Eastern State Correctional Facility. Sarah sat next to him, staring silently out the window. They hardly spoke the entire way, both immersed in their own thoughts. The procedure for entering the prison took about 20 minutes. They were met by the warden, Thomas Barnes, a tall man in his 40s with a military bearing. Detective Harris, Officer Mitchell, he greeted them. I'm sorry for your loss. Officer Downey was a good person. Thank you, Mr. Barnes, Harris replied. We're here to talk to Rayner. Of course, I've had the interrogation room set up. He's waiting for you there. Does Rayner know about Downey's death? Harris asked. Yeah, news travels fast, even in prison. He's, took it pretty hard. Have you seen his reaction? Not personally, but the guards reported that he was furious, smashed everything in his cell, had to put him in solitary confinement for 24 hours. Interesting, Harris muttered. And on the day of the murder, where was he? In his cell after lights out. We have a strict regime. All prisoners are in their cells from 19 o'clock. Were there any incidents that day? Maybe he behaved unusually after Downey's visit? Barnes hesitated. I can't say for sure. I'd have to check the logs and talk to the guards on his cell block. But one thing I do remember is that he had an altercation that day with another inmate, Victor Mendez. A little scuffle in the mess hall. Mendez? Harris interjected. Who's he? Small-time drug dealer. Doing time for distribution. I don't think he and Rayner knew each other before prison. I'll need to talk to him too. Sure, Barnes nodded. I'll have him brought in after Rayner. The interrogation room was small and impersonal. Gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 3 chairs. When Harris and Sarah entered, Michael Rayner was already sitting there, handcuffed to the table. He looked drained, dark circles under his eyes. The bruise Barnes had mentioned was already starting to yellow. Detective Harris, Rayner said, his voice hoarse. Finally, I thought you'd never come. Rayner? Harris sat down across from him. Sarah remained standing by the door. You know why we're here? Becky's dead, Rayner said bluntly. And you think I killed her or had her killed? And I didn't? Rayner grinned bitterly. How could I have done it? I'm here, behind bars. The day she died, I was in my cell from 7 in the evening. People like you always have connections on the outside, people willing to do your bidding. Me? Rayner shook his head. You're confusing me with a mobster from the movies, detective. I'm a petty criminal who got caught in an armed robbery. I got no connections, no money, no influence. But you do have motive, Sarah intervened. Jealousy, control. Becky was pregnant, she told you that day. Rayner's face twitched. Yes, she did, and I was, shocked, but happy. Why the hell would I want her dead? She was carrying my baby. Maybe that's why, Harris said. She'd be connected to the baby, but not necessarily to you. 2.5 years is a long time. She could have found someone else. More suitable. Becky's not like that, Rayner cut Rayner off. She loved me, and I loved her. Then explain the note to me. Harris placed a picture of a sheet in a plastic bag on the table. Congratulations on the baby. See you soon. M. This isn't your message? Rayner stared at the photograph, his face pale. No, I never... He fell silent, studying the note. It's not my handwriting, and I would never sign my name with just M. I always signed it Mike or Love You, M. Convenient explanation, Harris remarked. Detective James Harris stood in front of the wall in his office, hung with photos and notes on the Rebecca Downey case. It had been a week since her murder, but it felt like they were treading water. He'd spent a sleepless night going over every detail over and over again. Sarah Mitchell entered the office with 2 glasses of coffee, one of which she held out to Harris. You look terrible, she remarked. Thanks for the compliment. Harris grinned tiredly, taking the coffee. Any news? Yes. We got access to Rebecca's old files. I found something interesting in her history before she was transferred to our department. Sarah put some file folders on the table. 5 years ago, Rebecca worked in the domestic violence unit. She handled the case of Marcus Evans, accused of stalking and threatening his ex-girlfriend. And here's a photo of Evans. Sarah pulled out a photo of an attractive dark-haired man in his mid-30s with cold gray eyes. That description matches the man Parker saw, Harris said, scrutinizing the photo. Exactly, but there's something else. After Evans got probation thanks to Rebecca's testimony, he started stalking her himself, threatening phone calls, leaving notes, stalking. Rebecca even got a restraining order against him. Why didn't we know about this before? She transferred to narcotics shortly after that. I guess she wanted a fresh start. And 3 years ago, the restraining order expired, and she never renewed it again. Harris frowned. Where's this Evans guy now? That's the thing. Sarah shook her head. We can't find him. The last known information about him dates back to last year. He worked as an investment consultant for Apollo Finance, but he quit 6 months ago, and we've been missing his trail ever since. 6 months. Harris thought for a moment. Around the same time, according to Rayner, Rebecca started mentioning a stalker. Do you think it's him? Maybe. Harris nodded. We need to check this trail. Run it through all the databases. Sarah put a small, leather-bound notebook on the table. I found something else in Rebecca's things. Her personal journal. The last entries are disturbing. After she left, Harris opened the diary. The last entry was dated the day Rebecca died. Today, I will tell M about the baby. I'm afraid of his reaction. After what A said, I don't know who to believe. If he's right about M, I may have made a terrible mistake. But I have to give him a chance. For the baby's sake. For us. Harris flipped back a few pages. A showed up again. Says he knows things about M that I don't. Claims that M is using me. That his arrest and sentence are part of some plan. I don't want to believe it, but some of the details are starting to add up. Who is this E? Marcus Evans, obviously, but what did he know about Michael Rayner? And why did his return coincide with Rebecca's pregnancy? There was a knock on the door. One of the techs brought in the forensics report on the crime scene notes. Detective, we matched the handwriting from the note to samples of Rayner's letters. It's definitely not his handwriting. Are you sure? Positive. The handwriting on the note belongs to someone else. Also, we found a partial fingerprint on the back. It doesn't belong to Downey or Rayner. After the tech left, Harris thought about it. He now had 2 suspects, Michael Rayner and Marcus Evans. Both had motive. Both had opportunity. Rayner through accomplices, Evans personally. But which one had actually killed Rebecca? The phone on the desk rang. It was Sarah. "James, I found Evans. He's renting an apartment 3 blocks from Rebecca's house. He's paying cash, but he used his credit card yesterday at the grocery store next door." "Oh, that's great. Send the address. Meet me there in 20 minutes. Marcus Evans' apartment was in an old building with a shabby facade. Harris and Sarah, along with 2 patrol officers, went up to the 3rd floor. Harris knocked on the door. "Marcus Evans? Police. Open the door." Silence. After several attempts, the officers kicked the door open. The apartment was empty, but it looked lived in. On the kitchen table was a half-drunk cup of coffee, still warm. In the living room on the wall— "Oh my God!" Sarah exhaled. The entire wall was covered with pictures of Rebecca. Rebecca leaving the house, Rebecca in a coffee shop, Rebecca talking to co-workers, Rebecca entering the prison to visit Reiner. Hundreds of photographs connected by red threads. In the center is a photo of Rebecca with Michael, taken before his incarceration. A red target was painted over Reiner's face. "Looks like we found our stalker," Harris said grimly. In the bedroom, Harris found a drawer with copies of the letters Reiner had written to Rebecca from prison. Somehow, Evans had gotten access to their correspondence. "Sarah, look," Harris pointed to the desk where a notebook of notes lay. "Looks like Evans was gathering information on Reiner, his background, connections, crimes. There's even phone records from prison. How could he have gotten access to that? I don't know, but he's clearly obsessed with proving Reiner's a danger to Rebecca." Harris turned a few more pages and froze. Records of Reiner's meetings with one Carlos Lorenzo, in prison. Lorenzo? The drug lord that Rebecca and Reiner testified against? Yes, and according to these records, they met 3 times in the last 4 months. Harris frowned. But how is that possible? Lorenzo is in a maximum security federal prison and Reiner is in a county jail. Could Evans be mistaken? Or intentionally falsifying information? Harris suggested. Or Reiner did meet with Lorenzo, and then it changes the whole picture. In the bathroom, Sarah found a hiding place under the sink. Inside was a gun and a box of ammo. "James, looks like we found the gun." Harris examined the gun. "It's not what we're looking for. Rebecca was killed with a knife. But the fact that there is an unregistered weapon suggests Evans' intentions. We need to put out an APB on him now." On the way to the prison, Harris got a call from CSU detective. "We found something else. We found traces of blood in Downey's bathroom sink drain. DNA doesn't match the victim or Reiner. Maybe the killer hurt himself during the attack. Compare it to Evans' DNA as soon as you get a sample," Harris ordered. Warden Barnes met him at the prison. "Detective, I found out something about possible contacts between Reiner and Lorenzo." "I?" Officially, there was no such contact. But Lorenzo's attorney, Richard Stanton, visited Reiner 3 times in the last year, allegedly to consult on a possible sentence reduction. Stanton could have been a go-between, Harris said thoughtfully. "I need to talk to Reiner, alone." Michael Reiner looked exhausted. When Harris entered, he looked up without much interest. "You again, detective?" "I have new questions, Reiner." Harris sat down across from him. "About your relationship with Carlos Lorenzo." Reiner visibly tensed. "I don't have a relationship with Lorenzo. I testified against him. He hates me." "Then why has Lorenzo's lawyer visited you 3 times in the last year?" Reiner remained silent, avoiding Harris's gaze. "Listen, Reiner, we found Marcus Evans. You know him?" "The name. Familiar," Reiner answered uncertainly. "Becky mentioned him. Said he was stalking her before. And now too. He's got a whole wall dedicated to her. And you." Harris is quiet. "I want to know the truth about your relationship with Lorenzo." Reiner took a deep breath. "Okay. Stanton came to see me. He's been passing messages from Lorenzo. Threats, mostly. That if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd get Becky. And what did he want? He wanted me to keep tabs on her, reporting on her work, drug investigations. Lorenzo wanted to use her through me. And you agreed?" "No," Reiner exclaimed. "I was trying to protect her. I gave Stanton false information, generalities that could do no harm. But Lorenzo was getting more and more insistent. And then she told me she was pregnant. And you were afraid that now Lorenzo had even more leverage?" "Yes. I planned to tell her the truth that day. About Lorenzo, about Stanton, about everything. But I couldn't. She was so happy, so full of hope for our future. What about the fight with Mendez the day she visited? Mendez works for Lorenzo. He gave me a message. Either I start cooperating fully, or Becky will meet with an accident. I lost control and lashed out at him. And what did you do after that? Nothing. I was in my cell all night. Check the security cameras. Raynor stepped forward. Detective, I swear I didn't kill Becky. I loved her. And our baby. Harris got a call from Sarah. James, we got an update from patrol. They found Evan's car in an airport parking lot. He bought a ticket on a flight to Mexico, leaving in 2 hours. Get every available officer to the airport. I'll be there in 30 minutes. At the airport, Harris found Evans in the waiting room. He didn't try to run when he saw the detective. Marcus Evans? Detective James Harris. I need to ask you some questions about the murder of Rebecca Downey. I didn't kill her, Evans said quietly. I loved her. Then why are you trying to flee the country? Because I know what it looks like. My obsession with her, my past. You'll never believe me. Try to convince me. Evans sighed. I met Rebecca 5 years ago. She was prosecuting a case about me stalking an ex-girlfriend. I wasn't myself back then. After treatment, I realized how sick I was. When I came out, I wanted to apologize to everyone I hurt, including Rebecca. Is that why you started stalking her again? No, I mean, yes, I was watching her, but not like I had been. I noticed that she was seeing Raynor. I found out about him, his ties to the drug cartel. I wanted to warn her. Why did you care? Because I saw how he was manipulating her. Evans raised his voice. Raynor was using her. He never cut ties with Lorenzo. His arrest, his role as an informant, it was all part of the plan. They wanted to insert their man into the police force through her. How do you know that? I followed him before his arrest, saw his meetings with Stanton, Lorenzo's lawyer, heard their conversations. Raynor volunteered to go to prison to make new contacts and reinforce his legend. Did you tell Rebecca that? I tried. She wouldn't listen at first. But then, she started to see inconsistencies in Raynor's stories. She started to question it. And what happened the day she was killed? I don't know. We agreed to meet that evening. She wanted to show me proof of her suspicions about Raynor. But when I got to her house, the police were already there. I saw the body being taken out, and, He stopped talking. Forensics matched the DNA from the sink drain to a sample taken from Evans' apartment. Detective, it came back negative. The DNA in the sink drain doesn't belong to Evans. Harris decided to check Raynor's phone records and videotapes of his meetings with his attorney. Look, Sarah pointed to the screen. Stanton's handing something to Raynor under the table. Looks like a note, and Raynor tucks it up his sleeve. Richard Stanton was found in his office. He didn't seem surprised to see the police. You represent Carlos Lorenzo, Harris began, and you visited Michael Raynor 3 times in the last year. We want to know what you talked about. I'm afraid that's privileged information, Stanton replied. Even if those conversations involved planning the murder of a policeman? Stanton's smile twitched. That's a serious charge, Detective. Harris placed the surveillance photos on the table, showing the passing of the notes. What did you pass to Raynor, and what did he say? I want to talk to my lawyer. Sure, Harris nodded. But think about this. Lorenzo's already in prison for life. He's got nothing to lose. You have everything to lose. If we can prove your involvement in the murder of a police officer, you're looking at the death penalty, or you can cooperate and get a deal. Stanton went pale. I had nothing to do with the murder, I was just passing messages. What messages? Lorenzo wanted information about narcotics investigations. Raynor was supposed to get it from his girlfriend. And Raynor agreed? Not right away. At first he refused. Then Lorenzo started threatening the girl. Raynor became more, cooperative. What was in the last message you sent? I'm not sure. Lorenzo sealed it, but, he was very pleased. Said the problem would soon be solved. When was this? 2 days before Officer Downey was killed. Harris felt the pieces of the puzzle finally starting to fit together. Do you know the name Thomas Barnes? The warden? Stanton wondered. Sure. Why? Did he ever have any contact with you or Lorenzo? Stanton hesitated a moment, then nodded. Barnes occasionally helped with certain matters. For a fee, of course. Harris immediately headed back to the prison. Barnes greeted him with his usual professional courtesy, but Harris noticed the tension in his eyes. "Mr. Barnes," Harris began, "I want you to explain your relationship with Richard Stanton and Carlos Lorenzo." Barnes turned pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," Stanton confessed. "We know that you helped Lorenzo for money. Now I want to know what part you played in the murder of Rebecca Downey." Barnes collapsed in his chair, covering his face with his hands. "I didn't mean for her to die," he whispered. "I thought they'd just scare her, keep her quiet." "Who's they?" "Lorenzo's men. Stanton gave me the key to Downey's apartment. Said his men would just plant a threatening note. I didn't know they were going to kill her." "How did Stanton get a key to Rebecca's apartment?" "From Rayner. He had a spare key that he kept among his personal effects in prison. Yeah, helped Stanton gain access to it." "And what did you get in return?" $20,000, Barnes said quietly, "and a promise of another 80 after the case was closed." "Who exactly killed Rebecca?" "I don't know any names. Stanton said he'd send his men. All I had to do was alibi Reiner by confirming he was in his cell the whole time." "And the purpose of all this?" Rebecca began to suspect Reiner. She found evidence of his connection to Lorenzo. Evans helped her, and she was going to pass that information on to you. Lorenzo couldn't let that happen. Harris felt the bitterness of understanding. Rebecca was caught between two worlds, the world of the law she served, and the underworld into which the man she loved had dragged her. And both worlds betrayed her. The epilogue was bittersweet. Thomas Barnes agreed to testify against Stanton and Lorenzo in exchange for a reduced sentence. Michael Rayner was charged with accessory to murder. He knew of Lorenzo's plan, but didn't warn Rebecca, hoping his benefactor would just scare her. His double game, manipulating Rebecca's affections for the sake of information for Lorenzo, cost her life. Marcus Evans was vindicated. Despite his obsession, he did try to save Rebecca. His methods were unhealthy, but his intentions were sincere. Harris stood at Rebecca's grave a month later. Beside him was Sarah. "The worst part," he said quietly, "is that she died without knowing the truth, not knowing who was really worth being afraid of." "She chose the wrong person to trust," Sarah replied, "but she did her job to the end, trying to uncover the truth." "And it cost her life." Harris placed flowers on the grave. "Her and their unborn child." They stood in silence, thinking of the woman who had been caught between two worlds and crushed by their collision, of the mirrors in which she saw the distorted reflection of those she loved, mirrors that were now shattered, exposing the cruel truth too late.